Alrighty. Today is Thursday, January the 17th, 2019. We're interviewing Harold Katz in Cerritos, California. Mr. Katz is 93 years young, having been born on February 2, 1925.
February 21.
February 21. Okay, I missed the one. Sorry. Okay, we'll get that right. My name is Phil Wendell. Assisting me will be Vicky Pard. This interview is being done for the Los Angeles region of the American Red Cross, serving Greater Long Beach, Rio Hondo, and South Bay, in conjunction with the Library of Congress and the American Folk Life Center. Mr. Katz served in the Army from October of '43 to March of 1946 during World War II, achieving the rank of sergeant. Sir, first and foremost, I want to thank you for your service to our country. You were there at a vital time, and you, like millions of others that served in that war, saved the world. And we appreciate what you did.
Thank you.
So I want to hear your story. I want to have you go back to New York when you're growing up as a kid, and tell me about life as you remember it when you were a young kid, and tell me about your mom and your dad and what they were like.
Okay. You want me to start now?
You go. We'll start there and work our way through chronologically.
Okay. Well, as I was born in Brooklyn, New York, February 21, 1925.
And you still have your accent.
That's what you tell me.
That's right.
Yeah, well, there's some things you can't shake. Being in Brooklyn at that time, in shall we say, the history of the world, so to speak, was a pretty interesting time. Though I imagine for the city of New York, there's nothing but interesting times. But that was a time that lots of things were happening, lots of changes. I happened to check, and apparently I've lived so far through 17 presidential administrations.
Wow.
So a lot of water under the bridge, so to speak. I grew up in a neighborhood that was essentially made up primarily of immigrant populations. There were many Italian people with Italian descent, ethnic backgrounds, Polish, and Irish, some. Very, very few blacks, were almost exclusively Caucasian, and then a large population of Jewish people, of which I'm one.
Did they stay mostly in their own areas in the city, or did they mingle all over the city?
No, well, our neighborhood was kind of a mix, but people kind of lived. There were more of one ethnic or group in one area, one street, than there might have been on the other. But a lot of it had to do with the way the neighborhood was organized, because in my case, I lived in a part of Brooklyn that was almost, I don't want to call it semi-rural, but there was a lot of areas that were like truck farmers.
Okay.
And the Italian people primarily did that. And so they had, the neighborhood consisted of many of those people who owned that property, and a lot of immigrants that came in and occupied some of the developments in that area. So that kind of made for the mix. But yet there were individual little enclaves. And one of the things I remember very, very clearly is going down the street, and here was a home that I knew was Italian, and a pretty large property area for a city environment. And they had built a bocce court, because that was a very, very popular sport.
Right.
And I would watch sometimes when I'd walk by the men. I never saw the women play. The men play bocce, and they would play with their full body. I can still remember today the way some of them would run down the field and hurl that ball at the little pitch ball, the marker there, and yell, "Ah, bocce!"
Yeah.
To this day, I can still It's still there.
Sounds of home, huh?
What?
Sounds of home.
Yeah. So some of that, so the neighborhood, that kind of, that character to it. I was, the other aspect to the neighborhood was that it was originally settled by the Dutch. So there was a very, very old Dutch Reformed church in the neighborhood, as well as a cemetery. And I remember, of course, you know, you always had trepidations when you walked past the cemetery, especially when it was getting dark. So, we had to do that a lot because it was on the main street in that neighborhood, which was New Lots Avenue. And as you can see, the word New Lots, it kind of almost came from the Dutch, I think. They probably had their own way of spelling for it.
What was your dad like?
My dad, he was, well, I'll tell you, he was probably for that time a very typical dad. I didn't see too much of him because he was always working. And my father, not in addition to him, always, and this is my mother would say, don't complain about your father because he brings home the bread, which he did. And he made it a point. I know he had trouble sometimes finding a job, but he always went out and found a job. And whether it was taxi driving, whether it was being a carpenter, whether it was being a machinist, he was all of these things, and he was not educated. My father, I think, left school when he was maybe 8 years old.
Did he come from the old country?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, my father was born in...
So you're first generation then?
What?
You were first generation,
right?
Okay.
Yeah. My mother was born in England. She came when she was 2, and my father was born in what is actually, with the border lines changing all the time. At the time, we call it Poland, but it was probably part of Russia. The city of Brest-Litovsk. And that's actually the treaty city for, I believe, World War I. It was one of the cities where they negotiated the treaty. So anyway, he came from that part of the world. And as I say, he was a very, very industrious man, very hardworking. He wasn't, he wasn't really a father the way we have middle-class American fathers being conceived, you know, going out on the weekend and playing ball with their kids or taking them to places and stuff like that. But he was a lot of what I learned from him was more watching him and observing him than actually having him physically or actively saying, Harold, do it this way. You know, it was, he had a great deal of perseverance on any project. He was extremely industrious, very creative for someone who really, tell you the truth, I don't think he was very good at arithmetic. He would often ask me or my brother to do calculations for him, which we thought were relatively simple, but that was the way it was. But he had a great deal of imagination. In fact, he got at least 2 patents. You know, so they never panned out to be economically viable, but they were still creative enough and original enough for the patent office to think that they warranted identification as an individual type of item.
How about your mom?
Yeah, my mom, yeah, she was the one who, I would say, was a very, very strong motivator in our education, my education, I'm sure my brother's. My brother was 23 months older than me.
Just 2 of you?
Yes.
Okay.
So my mother was a great reader. She was very proud of the fact that she actually got an elementary education before she had to go to work, which she did. She went to she graduated from one of the local schools, PS 149 in our neighborhood. And she was very, very happy about that. She was the type of person who went on and got her high school equivalency when she was 50.
That's great.
You know, she was one of those people where education was important, She imparted it on me and my brother, and she supported it.
So your dad spoke Polish?
No, I think he probably knew, I'm almost certain he knew some Polish and Russian, because I know he talked to his father occasionally, and if they didn't want you to understand, they'd either speak Polish, Russian, or Yiddish. And I didn't know any of those languages, you know.
So your mom spoke Yiddish too then?
She did
so
too.
So she and her dad met that way, okay.
Yes,
okay.
But they didn't do that very much at home, again, unless they were trying to make sure that they weren't, their conversation was not being heard.
Was she a stay-at-home mom?
What?
Was she a stay-at-home mom?
Well, in a sense, yes. She had a business. She was a very, very industrious person, and there was always, you know, at that time, the people who were immigrant and were trying to Americanize, they wanted to acquire most of the things that they recognized that were the symbols of a middle-class American family. So she felt she had to go to work. But she was a beautician. She was actually a very, very good beautician. But she couldn't leave the house. She had 2 boys to look after. So she set up a business in her own home. And so one of our rooms in our home, I remember it was like the parlor room that looked out on the street. She made into a beauty parlor. And she, at one time, she had my aunt, her sister, and one of our cousins working for her. So there were the 3 ladies.
You did pretty well then.
Yeah, they were good hard workers, which I feel very proud about my family. And so, yes, they had a lot of good business, and they were good at their trade, you know. But the beauty parlor in the home, I think, influenced some of my educational objectives, in the sense that, I don't know if you're familiar with, if you've been in a ladies' beauty parlor, but it's almost like a chemical factory.
Oh, yeah.
And it was then, too. And so, you know, you had all these odors, you had all these chemicals, and certain equipment for making these ladies' hairs permanent things and curling them and all that stuff. And I was intrigued by a lot of watching my mother and my aunts work with their clients. I was going to say patients. And so that was a very, I think, it was important in my development in that industry, being busy and finding a way to make a living. There wasn't just one way to do it.
So you were about 10 at the height of the recession, the Depression, because you were born in 25 and the Depression hit in 1929. So
yes.
Thinking back when you're 10 years old, did it affect your family at all?
Well, actually, it goes back a little further than that, because I remember very clearly, I'm talking about being like less than 5. My father, because they had 2 kids, they had to take care of them.
Yep.
My father would take me to a job site, and this was when he was doing construction work, and that was really I really liked that. So here was a kid, maybe 4 or 5 years old, and there was no such thing as OSHA,
right?
Or anything.
No safety stuff going on.
You know, telling him what he could do and whether a child could be on the work site and whether he had to wear a helmet or not. There wasn't no such thing like that. And so I would go there with him, and he'd start working in the morning, and he would just say, leave me. He said, okay, you know, just don't get in trouble, and leave me. And so I could walk around the work site, pick up blocks of wood, try to do things with them, you know, there was a lot of sand because there would be concrete work and stuff like that, play in the sand. So there was a lot of stuff that was sort of gave me a chance to do things, and also go back and watch my father, and what he was doing. He was what they call parquet flooring. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
It's very, very intricate, actually very artistic floor designs and stuff like that go into that. And to do that type of work, you had to be pretty good. And so that's what he was doing at that time, and I would watch him. And he told me later on, I didn't realize this, that he didn't know a damn thing about parquet flooring when he got on a construction site. And the foreman, or however they organized construction jobs at that time, told him what the work was. My father said, yes, he can do it, And this is going back, like I say, 5 years old, 1930, something like that time, kind of the height of the Depression. And any job was you did anything you could to hold on to it. And so my father told me, this was later on, he didn't know anything about parquet flooring, but he would go and run over and see someone who was an experienced carpenter doing it, and then he'd go back to where he was told that he had to do it and repeat it and use that information literally, kind of like a learning.
Smart guy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Did he work all the way through the recession, or was he had?
He had different jobs. I don't know. I don't recall how long the construction was, but my father has already been. He's been a machinist, and apparently a good enough one, because some of the stuff he did for his inventions were strictly machining that he had to do. In fact, he bought himself a lathe, a 9-inch. It has what they call a 9-inch swing. And installed it in the basement, a lathe, a drill press, a grinder. He had a little workshop, and you always hope that the landlord didn't kick us out, because then where is he going to take on? Always a question. Anyway, so he worked at a bunch of different things. I know one of the things he did even when things were low and he couldn't get a job, he hacked taxi. Because I remember he brought home his medallion, big metal thing that they had to wear or keep someplace or other, whatever it was. So he did all sorts of things, and like my mom said, don't complain about your dad. He brings home.
So you didn't miss any meals then when you were...
What?
You didn't miss any meals then during that time?
I don't recall that. I think I was probably very fortunate, and my mother was a very good cook.
Went to school pretty close by?
My school, I started at PS 202, which was essentially a pretty new school. As you see by the number, 202 was pretty far advanced because New York school systems, as they made a new school, they gave it
a number.
Gave it a new number. And I had gone to, I started PS 202 for my kindergarten classes, and it was within walking distance, yes. And so we would walk to it. And that was another thing about our neighborhood. Apparently, because it was sort of on the outskirts of Brooklyn, if people know where Canarsie is, in the way the ocean kind of goes along the coast of New York City and goes along Brooklyn, there's an area that was called Canarsie, where apparently the Canarsie Indians were located as a tribal group. And that was only about walking distance, maybe at the most, maybe a couple of miles from where we lived. So we were living pretty close to the coast. And in between, it was sort of like marshlands, wetlands. But before you even got to the wetlands, there was an area where apparently prior to the crash, they started to build some apartment buildings, but they never finished them. So what we had there, about a block away from where I lived, was number one, big vacant lots, and number two, on some of them, we had these partially constructed buildings with girders hanging down and walls up so far and open to the sky, because they never got to complete much of them.
It's a playground.
Wonderful
Yeah,
playground.
yeah.
Wonderful playground. That's just exactly what it was. So that's where I spent a lot of my youth.
Did you go to high school there too, close by?
My high school, Thomas Jefferson High School, which I believe is still in business or still around, was a good mile or more from my home. So we would walk to that. But let me go back to PS 202
Sure.
for a second, because that was essentially a new school, and the New York City education system was in many respects extremely advanced, and they did a lot of innovative things. And since that school was new and it had a lot of space, they apparently put into it certain special services for students who were not who needed help, like eyesight. They had a sight conservation class. For people with a heart or cardiac condition, they had like what they called open air classes. And then they had classes for people who had developmental disabilities and who had physical disabilities. So the school had a lot of other students coming in from other areas, because it was like a magnet school in a sense that way. So I was very fortunate to start there in my kindergarten, and I can still remember Mrs. Smith, my kindergarten teacher. She was one of the few, but maybe one of the first black people I was ever in contact with. And she was just absolutely wonderful. You know, you couldn't have found a better human being. And I remember her to this day. And so my relationship with PS 202 was very happy. I had to leave when I was only in like the second or third, about the third grade, and go to a different school because we moved out of the district. But it wasn't very far. It was called PS 72. You could see the number, so it was a lot older school. And that was the one that was right across from the Dutch Reformed Church and Cemetery. And so I was there for a little while, and it was very normal, at least in my family, for us to move like almost every 2 or 3 years.
Bigger houses?
What?
Bigger house?
No, where the landlord will paint and improve the place.
Okay.
So, or maybe you got a better rent or something like that. I never could figure out the reason why we had so many moves, but I think in my first 13 or 14 years, we probably moved 4 or 5 times.
A lot.
So yeah, it is. About every 2 years, I remember, it was almost a routine. You
So
know,
you had to make new friends.
new friends, and we didn't move too far. You know, maybe 2 blocks over or 3 blocks over. So it was still in that New Lux neighborhood. Okay, but when I was in about my 4th or 5th grade, we did move further north, again in Brooklyn, and it may still been part of East New York. I can't recall that, which was what they called our neighborhood. And I moved to an area on Van Sicklen Avenue and to a school that was PS 62.
Really old.
And 62, it turned out, was actually at one time a hospital during the Civil War.
Wow.
So you can see what kind of use the New York City school system was doing with its facility requirements. And PS 62 was very interesting because it had classrooms on the first floor, and it only had a second floor. And the second floor was made into either one big assembly room by moving the walls, or 4 classrooms. It was either arrangement. So they had 4 classrooms when they had classes, and they had the assembly room by opening up all the doors, sliding them back, and then all the other kids from down below also would come up, and they'd share your seats with you for an assembly period. So that was kind of interesting.
So did you go to the same high school all 4 years?
Mm-hmm.
Or did you move in between?
No, because we were moving back and forth. We finally, after Van Sicklen Avenue, we came back into our old neighborhood, so to speak, and it was there on Ashford Street that I probably spent most of my time, and that's where we lived the longest, as far as I can remember, until I went into the service, and then my folks moved at just about that time, one more time, to another location in East New York, not very far from Ashford Street.
So were you very active in high school?
What?
Were you very active in high school, like football or baseball or track?
No.
Band?
No, more in the service areas and the academic areas. In the sports, because of my eye, I have very bad eyesight. Okay. In fact, there was always a question about whether Harold was kind of on the slow side because I didn't do too well in school for the first like 4 or 5 grades. And I finally got to an eye doctor, actually it was an optometrist, through one of my uncles who knew him very well, and he was able to fit me with glasses where I could finally apparently see. And my academic record just shot up because instead of failing mathematics, I now could see the board.
Yeah.
And I was in 5th grade at that time when this transition occurred. It was almost like a miracle, you know, and all it was good fitting of glasses.
So you could see leaves on trees, you could see license plates across the street, read all that stuff.
Yeah, right.
See the board of school, yeah.
Yeah, it was, you know, sort of like a miracle. And you just wondered how come the other doctors who'd seen me, some of them being, ophthalmologists and stuff, still didn't figure out what to do. I mean, they knew what I had. They knew that this eye was what they called it what's the word for it?
A lazy eye?
Lazy eye, right. That's what they called it. And that in itself, nowadays, is a lot of kids, you know, have that. They know what to do the moment it's diagnosed. They cover that up, you know, cover this one up, make this one work, which they didn't do. So it's sort of atrophied. And everything relied upon my right eye. My left eye, because my lazy eye is my right eye. And so, you know, it was one of those things that took a while. But even so, I was still legally blind in this eye, which is why I ended up being 4F in the service. So anyway, with high school, Thomas Jefferson was what we call an academic high school. You know, it wasn't oriented towards crafts or teaching technical skills to students. And again, New York City apparently had lots of different categories. This is an academic one, this is a tech trade one, and here we have our special science school and everything like that, music school, you know. And so it was it was a very good school. One of my uncles had attended it. My brother was there just 2 years before me. These people had left records, not always very good. And I have to laugh at some of them. I apparently came with a little bit of baggage, because the moment the teachers would know who my uncle was, who was there, he was only 7 years my senior. He was my brother's 5 years, so they were not too far apart. And apparently they had, my Uncle Bernie had left quite a record as, I I don't know, I don't want to call him a troublemaker, but apparently the faculty didn't necessarily think he was an ideal student.
Here comes another Katz coming, huh?
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, anyway, high school was really, I remember I ran and I was elected to vice president of the student government for the annex. The school was so large that the main school couldn't handle all the students, so I think there were at least 1 or 2 annexes, and I was in one of them until you could reach like sophomore year. So you almost exclusively, any entering freshman would be sent to an annex until they would go to the main campus for their sophomore through graduation. So I did that, and I was active in some of the clubs. Academically, I did quite well, so I was elected to the organization called ARISTA, which is the kind of the academic, or I don't know how far it goes, but I understand that ARISTA is an organization that is in the high schools throughout the state of New York. It's one of those sort of. And I was very active in the service council. I know one of the things I enjoyed very much, they had what they call the Key Squad. The Key Squad was responsible for helping the teacher who monitored all the keys for the whole campus. And we surprised all the businesses we had, making new keys and repairing locks and stuff like that. It was kind of fun. And I enjoyed doing that. And the teacher who had that was one of our math teachers who I liked very much. So that was a nice experience. I was elected to be head of ARISTA at one point, and then also active in the service council, as I said. There was a lot of things to do, and we had a very, very socially and politically conscious student body. I have to be, I'm very pleased that I had that type of environment. And this was a time when communism was pretty, there were a lot of contentions in our society. We weren't quite sure whether Russia or the Soviet Union was for the Allies or against the Allies and stuff like that. And there was a very strong, as you might know, in New York City, very strong radical labor orientation. And this all filtered down into neighborhoods and families and into schools. And so in our school, there was a fairly strong, and ethnically and religious, in terms of like, if you want to think of Judaism as an ethnic character rather than just a religious one, more one describing a cultural environment. A lot of those people were very socially active, and so people either came to campus having strong feelings about communism or about what I would call liberal democracy. And there wasn't too much really considered any other ways of looking at things. And so even at our age, we sort of had to make a commitment as to which one we felt more supportive of and inclined to. And I belonged to the group that was more the liberal group of people who are what we consider to be anti-communist. There might even be people who were socialist, but they were anti-communist. So anyway, this was an important component, and a lot of our club activities I remember I was in a debating club, and one of the things that was going on at the time I was there was a state, in the state of New York, there was a group called the WWII Committee, and they were essentially like a what's his name, from the 50s.
McCarthy?
What?
McCarthy?
No, yeah, right. They were like a pre-McCarthy group, and they were a very conservative group of politicians who were attempting to establish some very, very rigid and restrictive laws in the state of California, given the fact that, you know, the world atmosphere was becoming very, very charged with the issues of communism, fascism, and democracy. And so there was an issue, a debating issue came up, which was a couple of laws that were being considered, or bills being considered, and we had a debate on it, be for or against. And I took the position, I didn't believe in the laws, that I was as much opposed as anybody, but I took the position of the for, the pro, just to, there had to be an argument for the other side. And this young man who was the president of the Young Communist League took the against position. And we had our debate. And apparently, and of course then what it is you throw it to the group to say who won the debate, you know, whose argument was the best. And it turned out that my arguments were the best. And so even though I was pro, and my arguments were more supportive from a logical, debatable point of view than the Communist Party's position, I won the debate. So we had that type of environment of, number one, you could talk about a condition that you didn't like, and you could debate it. And it wasn't a question of saying, we're not even going to think about it, or we're not going to discuss it. You'd go your way and we'll go our way. And I thought that was kind of a good lesson to get from your high school education.
So December the 7th, 1941, you're 16 years old.
Yeah.
When Pearl Harbor's hit.
Yeah.
What do you recall about that?
You know, I remember, of course, hearing about it, and maybe even listening, I'm sure listening on the radio, no question about it. And it was probably as stunned as just about anybody would be and then I was sufficiently politically alert and read the newspapers and everything, so this was big news. And I know that that in my family, of course, there was a great deal of, shall we say, angst as a result of that action, because I had uncles who were of the age of military service, you know, without any question, and so there was always that issue. I think we didn't. My recollections now was that we had because of the fact that I'm Jewish, and we were getting information, not through only the newspapers. Like my grandfather, he would read the Jewish papers, you know, and they carried a lot more information than the American papers did about what was happening in Europe in terms of Germany's oppression of the Jewish people. So we would get a lot of these stories, even more so than the average population, as to how bad Nazism was. And we were also getting input from family members. So my environment and the things impressing me at that period were a little more complex than just the normal type of public information type of thing. So as it turned out, my brother, who had graduated high school just about a year before, he enlisted in the service. And we all questioned my brothers because he enlisted in the cavalry. Now, what kid from Brooklyn selects the cavalry? You know, and of course, at that time, the cavalry was horse cavalry,
Right.
and it was out in the west someplace. You know, that's where they had these guys because they were out there previously fighting the Indians. You know, so. Anyway, so Art enlisted in the cavalry about a year after, about 1942. And so he went out there, and he would send us letters and telling us what he was doing, shoveling horse manure and stuff like that. But he was also asking me to send him things. He was assigned, very soon after he did enlist, his unit converted from horse cavalry, which it was when he got there, to mechanized. And so he was in these like half-track type vehicles,
Right.
which took the places of horses. And the basic function was still the same, to do reconnaissance, scouting, things like that. And that was the job. And so he got the position of being a communications the communications person on things. So he had to learn Morse code and stuff. Of course, both of us were in scouting, so he probably knew a little bit of Morse code, but nothing like you had to do to use it as a communications tool. So I remember he said, you know what, we got these old things that you tap with your finger, very ineffective, very inefficient. There's another type of Morse code set called, which has a flipper. And instead of going this way to get dots and dashes, this one is a dot, that's a dash. He said, get me one of those. The Army didn't have it, so he asked me to hunt one up, which I did, and send it to him. It was that type of initiative, by the way, that my brother exercised. Anyway, what I'm saying is that we had some sort of ancillary contact with the service before we even whatever.
Did he go over to Europe?
What?
Did he go to Europe?
Oh yeah, he did. Yeah, he went to Europe. He got 5 battle stars. He landed about 10 days after VE Day, which was fortunate for him, because for those people in his unit that went in on VE Day, not VE, D-Day, I'm sorry.
D-Day, okay.
D-Day. They didn't do too well. I think my brother told me they lost about half their unit. But there was circumstances which kept him from going right that landing. But he went about 10 days later. So he saw, he got said 5 battle stars and 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. And it was in the Bronze Star incident, which occurred during, from what I remember, the Battle of the Bulge, that I had an opportunity when I went to Europe to see him, and we slept side by side in the hospital at that time. So it was a very nice experience.
Did he survive?
Yes.
Good.
In fact, he'll be 96 in March.
That's a good gene pool you have there.
Yeah, right. Yeah, but he's a little beat up from the wounds that he got. Some of them were pretty bad.
Now, they couldn't draft you, right?
They didn't.
When you get out of high school.
I had 4F classification.
Because of your eyes.
Because my eyes. So I remember how I tried to enlist in the Navy, in the what was then the Air Corps, and in the Coast Guard. And I got, don't even enter our door type of commentary because of my eyesight, And of course, I tried to enlist in the Army, but they didn't take me at that. So I just kept moving. I kept pressing my draft board. I said, I want to serve, but you're 4F. We don't know how to.
Well, why'd you want to serve so much? Why do you think?
Well, I tell you, it was a combination. Number one, I felt very strongly about what was happening. I was a very aware young man of that. And so there was a great feeling that, maybe I ought to do something also. But my brother was in, and my two uncles, in fact, they were already in North Africa, both of them, and we were hearing, about them. So there was the family. I felt this was something that I should do. And I'll tell you the truth, I just graduated high school.
Right.
And I started to go to college, and I didn't fit in my own mind. Whatever I expected of college at that time in my life, it wasn't the right thing. So I didn't do too well. I said, what the heck, this doesn't make any sense. I'm going to do what I feel I can do. And that's when I kept pushing the draft board until sort of their requirements or whatever they could accept and my, shall we say, activities or efforts finally joined. And they said, okay, you can come in. I got
We needed more bodies out there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So obviously they felt that they could make use of me, which was good. And I had no idea what that would be. So that's how I got in.
So how was saying goodbye to mom and dad when you took off to go to your boot camp?
How much what?
How was saying goodbye to mom and dad?
I can hardly remember that. I don't know whether there was a lot of emotion. Of course, my brother, well, there must have been because, here now, she had two sons who were going to be in the service, I know that there were already stories back, like I think it was the Sullivan brothers or something like that, the name, where they had 5, and they kind of laid the ground rule that you won't take that many from one
Right.
family because there's a chance that maybe all of them might not survive. And so there were feelings like that. And here's my grandparents already, that they would have 2 of their children and 2 grandchildren in the service. But I think there was definitely a feeling that there was service to be done. And so, okay, Harold, you want to, that's it.
Where'd you go to boot camp?
I'm sorry.
Where did you go to boot camp?
Okay, yeah, that's another interesting thing. I got assigned to I had no idea, I got my bag, they told me, they gave you some instructions about not taking clothing and stuff because you're going to change everything. So I remember getting on the subway and going down to where we had to go, Grand Central Station or wherever it was, that we had to go for being directed towards our destination, which was some camp, I don't know which one it was in New York at the time. And I ended up apparently being assigned to the Corps of Engineers, and I was sent to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, for combat engineering training. So I couldn't quite figure that out.
Did you go to boot camp first?
Yeah,
And that was where boot camp was?
what?
That was where boot camp was?
Yeah,
Okay,
right.
gotcha.
Yeah, my first activity in the service was to go to boot camp, and that was Fort Belvoir, and I think there's a picture someplace or other of the group
Yeah,
of
those pictures.
our group in my collection there. So anyway, I went to Fort Belvoir, Virginia, for my combat engineering training. Obviously, I didn't figure I was going to be in the combat unit because, of my eyesight. I was pretty sure that they were going to designate me as a non-combatant, and but that's where they sent me. You know what? She didn't duplicate that. Okay. It was a picture of all of the graduates of that boot training class.
Okay.
So that was in October 21, 1943. I remember the date very, very definitely. I will never forget the date. And it would be a picture of like about 100 and some odd people, soldiers. Anyway, the boot camp was it was not at a good time of the year, though I don't know whether that Washington area there's ever a good time, or maybe there's 2 weeks of spring and 2 weeks of autumn that might be good, and the rest of the weather is bad. But this was winter time, so it was pretty rough. A lot of coldness. Of course, we're sleeping in tents and stuff like that. Going through all of the training that combat engineers did, learning how to use things like Bangalore torpedoes so you could blow up what do you call it, barbed wire fences and stuff, doing the infiltration course, doing the gas mask exercises and all that. In fact, but the Army was very, very good because of my poor eyesight. They have the records. They actually fitted my gas mask with a special pair of glasses. So, because they knew I'd have to take these off,
right,
you know, in order to put the gas mask on
seal.
and make a good seal around my face. So they actually had a pair of prescription lenses.
The Army got one right for a change, huh?
Yeah, they probably got a couple of things right, but yeah, that was good. I was, you know, I don't know how good they were because, you know, you can't get very good fit when something like that's on your eyes, but it was probably better than not having any at all because my eyes were not very good, especially my right eye. Yeah. So anyway, the boot training was pretty rigorous rather, and.
Recall your drill instructor's name?
Do
you recall your drill instructor's name?
No.
Okay.
No. I could probably pick his picture out if I had that picture, but I don't see it. Anyway, they were very good, and we worked very hard.
For 3 months? 3 months or 2 months?
17 weeks.
17 weeks, okay.
Yeah. And actually I had a couple, because it was a winter time, I experienced a couple of things. I remember very clearly passing out while I was pulling targets during one of the periods. You know, we used to take turns. These guys would shoot, the other guys would be down below them moving these targets up and down so they had a target to shoot at, and then they could inspect it. I remember I was in the pits there pulling targets and I passed out. I have no idea, and I don't even remember the previous half hour or day. All I remember is that I passed out. The next time I found myself, I was in a hospital. So apparently I didn't realize it, but I had a very, very bad case of what I call nasal pharyngitis or something like that. I don't know, some sort of congestion and all that stuff. But the Army took good care of me, and then they sent me back to the unit when I was healed. And I remember being in the hospital for a couple of days while they took care of me. So that was it was a good experience from the point of view of knowing that they would take care of you. Mm-hmm. I wasn't too happy about having to have that happen. The other thing that I remember very vividly of my basic training was the final sort of shall we say challenge that the trainees would have to go through, other than like the infiltration course, which was in itself quite a challenge. And I was really quite surprised. They were blowing stuff up right around us, you know. That's the plan. You just had to be careful, you know. And they were shooting live bullets over your head. Don't stand up. So I remember crawling. I remembered that served me when I became a homeowner. That experience of the infiltration course actually served me in taking care of my property, because I had to get under my house. I had a crawl space, and it was a crawl space. There was no way of getting up. You couldn't move your body more than 5 or 6 inches. And I had to crawl around my house to see about putting in some other electrical fittings and stuff like that. And I remember I had to dig out so I could get below some rafters that were there. And if it wasn't for that infiltration course, I probably would have had claustrophobia or what have you. Whereas that kind of, you know,
It worked, yeah.
you know, I could do that, you know. It's one of those things. So anyway, the area of the challenge was what was called the 20-mile force march. And that was our last sort of basic experience in our training. And when you went through that, you succeeded, then you were fit for service. Because we had to, if I remember, we had to have our full backpack, which they tell me weighed about 60 pounds. And we had to have our M1 rifle. And that's another thing. I was issued an M1 rifle, and I had that M1 rifle from the day that they issued it to me, which was very soon after I got it down to Fort Belvoir, until I was discharged. And that one, I had that one weapon with me all the time, and it was my job to keep it functional and to, you know, take care of it and not to lose it or get it messed up. So I knew the serial number of my M1 till, I don't know, 10, 15 years after I was in the service, then kind of went out of my mind. But I knew my Army serial number and my M1 rifle number. Okay, so anyway, this 20-mile forced march was really a challenge. And I recall this was, would have been, since I was there October, November, December. It was sometime around that time of year. I think it was shortly after I may have gotten out of the hospital. And the road that we had to go on was like a sheet of ice, because in Washington, it doesn't so much snow as it gets a lot of moisture, a lot of ocean fog comes in and stuff like that, and then that freezes. And so the roads are just, like I say, a sheet of ice. And of course, these are dirt roads. They're not, so then they got their curvature to them, that the typical type of military grounds roads would have. And so we started out on that, and I don't know, I would say I probably fell anywhere from 15 to 20 times on that road. But I got up again, got myself together, and I said, "You're going to move on, Harold. You're going to move on. You're going to make this thing." Now, I finally finished that 20-mile forced march. About, I would say, not more than half our unit finished that assignment.
They just quit.
They just quit, and they had the car, I forget what they call them, the bus truck that they had, pick them up and bring them in. And I remember while I was at the end of the line, I was exhausted, and some of these guys were coming in this truck, big smiles on their face. And I don't know, I think maybe I don't know, in retrospect, I think I probably just shook my head. And I said, I really said something very interesting to myself, because I remember it to this day, because I know how I felt. I said, you know, this Jew boy made this ride. This Jew boy made this trip. That's what I said. Because you got to understand that religious discrimination was not necessarily something only going on in Europe. And we had plenty of it in our own lives, on and off. And in a service, you get people from all different walks of life, and they don't know who you are. But so you pick up a lot of stuff, and you hear a lot of things that you would not like to hear. And so when I finished that, I said there was another thing that crossed my mind. I happen to know a fair amount about Christian religion, and I said, you know, I felt like Christ all the time, falling down and picking up. And that's what I said. And I remember to this day how those two thoughts, that this Jew boy made this trip, and seeing these other guys come back, riding the truck and big smile. That was like that probably was kind of a high point.
It's a milestone, yeah.
You know, in my basic training, and maybe even a good part of it my military experience. Yeah, I didn't run into too much discrimination. A couple of episodes, one not very nice one, but by and large, I didn't have too much of a problem.
So where did you go from basic training?
I'm sorry.
Your next assignment after basic training, where did you go?
I was assigned to a unit. That's where I was assigned to Company A, 361st of Special Service Engineer Regiment. And they sent me down to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana.
A little warmer down there, huh?
I'm sorry?
A little warmer down there.
A little warmer down there. Yeah. Yeah, so that was kind of like in the beginning of spring of 1944. And of course I was like, this, you know, 17 weeks is almost like, it's almost close to 3 to 4 months, you know.
Right.
Yeah. So it was about springtime of 44, and the unit was just being sort of assembled, or at least Company A was, with the object that they were going to go overseas as soon as they had whatever preparations the Army or the Corps of Engineers and designates for their units. So I was probably one of the youngest people in that unit. Most of the people you can see, it's called a Special Service Regiment. There were, from what I understand, there were only two Special Service engineering regiments in the whole Army. It was a very, very special type of unit. And what its specialty was basically construction contracting. It was designed more to oversee the construction of large projects by either utilizing prisoner of war labor or local labor and our special equipment for the heavy components of the construction project. We had a lot of heavy equipment, bulldozers, dump trucks, ground levelers, turnipoles, all of the major type of large construction equipment. Well, these were all operated by specialists. So most of the people in the unit were these specialists, and they were either enlistees or they were drafted, but they had these special skills. And because of their specialty and their knowledge, most of them were not youngsters. They were in, I would say the average age was probably over 30. It was, if we had the picture of the group and we could see it, you'd see that many of
They were all called Pappy then, huh?
pretty much so. And so the younger people, like me, who were sent there, were more kind of to be filled in for the, shall we say, the drudge type of work that had to be done, whatever that might be. I did it when I finally got assignments when I was in the unit after going through the training. Now the training we got was, again, it didn't make any difference. They didn't know whether I was going to do this or this, but we all got the same training. And we got training in things like road building. We got training in railroad, rebuilding railroads and things like that. We got training in doing certain types of construction projects that they into bridge building, particularly things along that line. Those types of things that, regardless of whether you end up doing it or not, they figure you have to know the fundamentals of those. So it was kind of interesting because my basic training, the training I had in my unit, was kind of interesting. There aren't too many white guys that ever had to work on a chain gang, but we had to. I mean, you know, the units were all segregated. Blacks were in one unit and whites were in the other. But here we were, a white unit, but one of our assignments was possibly to build clean up railroad yards, move track, put new track down. So we had to do that. So, well, we had the guy who was the sergeant responsible for that part of our construction training. He used to push prisoners down in Georgia, you know. So he taught us how to sing the songs that the blacks would sing on their chain gangs. So we would do this all to the chain gang rhythm, you know, that you had to do because you couldn't pick up a length of track, you know, that weighed, I don't know, maybe a half a ton or something like that, unless you all picked it up at the same time.
Right.
And the only way to do that is to all have the same
Get
rhythm.
the rhythm, yeah.
You know, so we learned these songs really as just part of the job, so to speak. But it was fun. You know, I remember that very vividly. You know, the other thing that being down there in Camp Claiborne, by the way, Claiborne was in a location where there were like 2 or 3 other major military units. And so there were a lot of soldiers in that area. And there was, I believe, a large Air Force, Army Air Force program also in that area. So and this is, Camp Claiborne is right almost near a town called Alexandria, Louisiana, which is like in the heart. You couldn't draw a better central point for Louisiana if you couldn't, other than Alexandria. So that's where we were located. And this area had bayous or marshes all around it. You know, most of the arable land had been made out of these marshes by draining them in one way or the other. Anyway, we had a large portion of that around us, and so we had the type of flora and fauna that you would expect around that type of arrangement. So anyway, because of this Air Force training place, one day, unfortunately, we got word that one of their planes went down. One of their training missions went down. Apparently it was a single pilot in a plane, and they needed help from the soldiers to go through the marshes and find his body. And I don't know, they probably you know, they didn't have the same type of sensing equipment we have today.
Sure.
They didn't have helicopters and stuff like that. So, you know, you did it by, so what they did, here's this unit, like I said, we had over 100 people in our company, maybe even more, and they lined us up, just one straight line.
Shoulder to shoulder kind of a thing. Yeah.
And go, okay, now guys, we're going to start, we're going to walk through the marsh. We know that this pilot landed someplace in front of you, but we don't know where. And we want to find his body as soon as we can. And he'd already been, I think it was the day before, had crashed. And so what we did, we walked step by step over, so you stepped over a log. Well, it might be that the ground was where the other part of the ground was when you stepped on, before you stepped, but it might also be a ditch. So you ended up sometimes at this deep when in fact you started out, you know, down to your belly button, and now you're up to your chest, walking in this swamp area, which was not really very hospitable because of things like coral snakes and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway, we found him, and I was going to say, maybe fortunately, or I was in the group very close to him, so I had a chance to see the poor guy, and he'd been in that area down, like I say, a day or so, and already, you know, his face had changed and was blackened as it deteriorated and bloated from the heat and the moisture and everything like that. But we were lucky that we were able to find him, and but that was a kind of a interesting experience at Camp Claiborne.
Where did you go from Louisiana?
Well, before I leave
Okay.
Louisiana, I want to mention one more thing which has always been in my mind as I think about what happened when I was in Louisiana. First of all, we were always cautioned. You know, everyone had a foot locker, and so you kept all your stuff there, and you had to be very careful. So we were always cautioned that you never open your foot locker and put your hand in. You might open your foot locker, but then you look and make sure there's no black widows, there's
Snakes.
no snakes, no centipedes or anything like that. But I remember one of the things that we had to do, we had to sort of take one of our tents. We were adjusting the tents or the flooring and stuff. So we had to jack up one end of a tent, and we had to jack it up about a foot or so. And so there in the hole where the post was previously positioned, there was a centipede. I gotta say, I'm not exaggerating, 10 to 12 inches
Wow.
in length, you know. So you don't put your hand down there.
They don't bite too much anyway.
So, you know, those types of, I remember that so vividly as a good learning experience about, you're not going to be encountering raising the ends of tents very often, but just be careful. And also be careful. You always shook your boot out. Never put your foot in it until you've shaken it out, you know, because who knows what's going to crawl in the night before. So those types of things took place. One of the things we did is, I believe it was Saturdays. Every Saturday there was a muster of which the total camp assembled. I'm talking like a battalion, maybe even more than one battalion, because this was a big training center for the engineers, not just my unit, I think. And we assembled, we all had our place to be, and now this was getting to be, we're in like the summertime, it's getting pretty hot.
Mosquitoes are about that big?
What?
Mosquitoes are that big?
Mosquitoes and anything else that you can think of flying around. The worst thing is, of course, the moisture and the heat. So we were assembled in this parade on a Saturday assemblage. I forget exactly what they call it, mustering. And the reason we were doing it that particular Saturday, or the event taking place, other than the fact that we normally would do this, that they would report and say, Company A, Battalion B, whatever it is, we're here, all the other malarkey that goes along with the official Army type of designations, was they were going to have an execution. And we were all there to witness that. And they wanted all of us there to witness that. Because this man had violated whatever law it was that he was accused of, and it was a death penalty, and he was going to be executed, and the whole camp, the whole fort was going to witness it, to what I presume a lesson that we should take home. So that's what we did that Saturday. And of course there were...
Was it a firing squad?
What?
Was it a firing squad?
No, it was a hanging.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a hanging. And but
Just
we
don't
had-
do what he did then, huh?
Yeah, right. I don't remember them telling us what he did or what it was, but I'm sure we could have found out if we wanted to. But I do know in standing in that heat, for the length of time that we had, there was more than one or two people who passed out. Because you had to stand, even if you stood at ease, which is a relatively relaxed position, it's still a formal one. Mm-hmm. You don't slouch or anything. So anyway, that was a really kind of interesting mark in my memory of Camp Claiborne. Yeah. And the other thing that before we leave is just to say that the citizens of Alexandria, which is a relatively small town, even at that time, I don't know, it might have been big for Louisiana, but it was relatively small. And they had a Jewish population there, mainly I think people who were in, doing merchant type business or something like that. And so it was Passover, and they invited those Jewish soldiers who wanted to come and participate in the Passover dinner. And so I went to the dinner for that event and met a lot of the townspeople. Normally speaking, I didn't have very much relationship with them. And they were all very, very nice. But the very interesting thing is they all spoke with a Jewish with a Southern accent.
Yes.
So, it just didn't ring. It rang a little different to my ear. But so, that's the way it is. And the other thing is, before we leave, is to say that they did give us passes. I don't recall whether I got a furlough to go back home during that period, which I may have, but I definitely did get passes to go to New Orleans. And that was really quite inspirational, because I was a kid. I was always interested in music and stuff like that, but we could move from tavern to tavern, even during the daytime, and hear good New Orleans jazz and stuff like that. It was that particular experience was really very, very nice.
Good. Now where did you go?
Well, when we left Camp Claiborne, we went directly overseas. That's when we...
You go by ship?
Yes, I went by the New Amsterdam.
Out of Virginia or New York?
No, out of New York.
New York. So you got home for a couple of days.
What?
Did you get home for a day or two?
I don't know if I did. I don't recall. Maybe I did, and I'm not sure. It's interesting that period is not very clear in my mind, just what transpired. But I did leave from New York. It was a Holland American line. It was the New Amsterdam, which when I did a little research, I discovered that Holland American, maybe other merchant lines did, they use the name over and over again, even though they're different ships. So they decommission one ship with that name, and then they'll recommission another ship with that name. Sometimes they might call it too, but this was called the New Amsterdam, and that name has apparently, even the present day, there's a New Amsterdam, but it's not the same vessel, they tell me, that I sailed on.
How was the trip over?
What?
How was the trip over?
Yes, right, and
Anybody get seasick?
I don't know, I didn't.
You didn't?
No.
Okay.
In fact, I've never been seasick. I've traveled, I traveled 36,000 miles by sea during my Army time, which is approximately, and I think I traveled like about 93 days on shipboard. And this was the first one of my travels.
At least you weren't being shot at, though, right?
Yes, at least that we weren't being shot at. Well, the interesting thing, of course, at that time, because that was still 1944, let's say was that 1944? Yes, yeah, it was October 1944.
When you went over.
Right.
So it was following D-Day then? You were
Yes, it was.
behind
Yes,
D-Day by a couple of months.
Yeah, I think I used to joke about I went over a D+4 or something like that. That's months.
Yeah.
But we did. It was still a war on, of course, and there were still concerns about submarine attacks on Allied shipping. But the reason we went on the New Amsterdam is because it was so fast and so maneuverable. They felt that it had the capability of avoiding submarine attack, so it didn't need to go in convoy.
Same as the Queen Mary.
The same
The
with
Grey
the,
Goose,
with
yeah.
the big with
So
the Queen
fast,
Mary,
yeah.
exactly. So we went, and it was true that the way the ship did move, and you could see it and feel it as a passenger, it was going fast, and it would, because it would move and it changed its angle of course so frequently, you would see the ship heel over and move now in a different direction. And if you were having your meal, you better hold on to your mess gear, or it's going to go flying all over the place.
So were you guys in bunks, like 3 high or 4 high?
Or 6 high.
6 high? Which one is the best, the top one or the bottom one?
You know, I don't really remember, but I think some people prefer the bottom one because the top one really had a lot of movement.
Yeah.
You know, I mean the arc. So I can't recall whether I really had much in the way of choice on things like that. So, but it was. I think it took us 5 days to cross, if I'm not mistaken. And so we did it in 5 days, and we landed in Scotland, the Firth of Forth, and then got on to a troop train, which took us directly to Southampton, which we got off. We did nothing in between. They weren't taking any chances letting any of these GIs off the train. And we got on to this Channel ship, and as soon as we were loaded, apparently took right off to, I think we went to Omaha Beach.
Okay.
You know, and we landed the same way the other troops did, down the side of the ship on nets, crawling down the side of the ship onto landing craft.
LSTs.
No, not these are the little landing craft. These are the ones that go up on the. No, LSTs are pretty big.
Right.
So
Okay.
it's I'll tell you about the LST. It's one of my other trips. But anyway, one of these crafts that take like about 30, 40 GIs at a time.
Landing crafts. They're built by Higgins.
Yeah. So, and they would go right up on the beach, and you would march out of them. So we went down with all of our gear, you know, strung around us, and backpack and rifle, all that stuff down this net onto the craft, and then onto shore. But by that time, we didn't have to worry about people shooting at us or doing anything nasty. Yeah. So that was
They
Normandy.
were about already past Paris by then, weren't they?
Well,
They were already in Paris by then.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
so. They could have been, yeah. Because we didn't really pay too much attention. We had plenty to do when we got to we were in Normandy, and Normandy, you know, had this big the city con, CAE, and
Right.
very large city, but it was also bombed to pieces by us, maybe by the Germans after us. And so there was a lot of work to be done. And that was one of our first assignments, was to sort of try to get that rail yard back into functioning condition, because it was a very important distribution point for the continuation as we move further east in the battle. So that was one of the first assignments that our unit got, was to do that. But we also had some other big assignments when we were in Normandy. One of them was to build a hospital complex. And I'm talking about, you know, a brick and mortar hospital, not a tent city. And what we did, the assignment, there was I think it was probably a French Army cavalry area, and they had a lot of facilities, basically the stables for the horses. And so they were like big open areas, you know. And so what we had to do was to gut them and put in new concrete floors so that they could make like wards out of this place, and do that, and then build whatever infrastructure related to that type of thing. And so that was the type of, I'm laying this out because that's the type of projects they gave the 361st. It was those type of construction. So there were a lot of trades that were involved in that. Concrete work, carpentry, electrical, and road work, where they had to build the roads outside, and especially in cleaning out the rail yards, where they had to do demolition type cleaning because of the mines that were previously put in by the Germans. So those were some of the projects that we did when we were in France. There was a couple of pictures, I think. Yeah. Here's some. This was taken in Normandy.
Let's see if I can get it on the video here.
Yeah, but some of the guys kind of horsing around with putting their helmets on. But
Are you in that picture?
yeah,
Which one are you?
The glasses.
I'm that handsome guy right in the middle.
The guy with the glasses?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, with the glasses.
You
That's
thought we
right.
recognized you, yeah, the guy with the glasses.
Oh yeah, I wore my glasses throughout my.
You had to, because you were blind.
I couldn't see. Yeah, and this was at Camp Claiborne. These are the types of, just to let you know, these are the types of tents we were located in. That's
you.
Yeah, and
Very
kind of
good over
horsing
here.
around.
Let me get it a little higher. Here we go.
Oh, I see. Yeah. Okay. And on one of the times I had a little time off, they had in France, there's so much historical stuff, castles and places like that, you know. So when I had my time off, I visited one of these ancient castles, and this was one of my buddies must have taken this picture of me sitting up on the parapet of this castle, probably looking and thinking about home.
Undoubtedly. That's an old church right there.
Yeah, right, exactly. And this may have been taken on one of my possibly furloughs when I was in Camp Claiborne. Either that or this is with my mother. It's probably one of the first times I got home after I'd been inducted into the service.
She was a proud mama.
Yeah, she was. And this was a picture of me in Normandy, one of the locations.
With your glasses off.
Yeah, I'm right, because so they can see how pretty a guy he was. Okay, we'll get to these.
Okay.
Japan.
How far did you get into France?
One of the areas we moved to after we left Normandy was around, and I don't know the pronunciation, but the city of Reims, R-E-I-M-S. I think it's the French pronounce it Reims or something like
you're
that.
right.
So we were stationed in that area, and it was in that area that we were. That is when I was notified by the Red Cross, or actually my orderly room, that the Red Cross had said that I should go visit my brother.
And he was in Paris.
What?
He was in Paris?
He was in Paris, in a hospital in Paris.
Because he was injured.
Yeah, because he had been wounded from...
He was in the Battle of the Bulge, right? Your brother? Okay.
Yes, yeah. So it was around that time, in terms of timeline, that
That
we
was,
were...
that was about December or so of
Yeah.
44, yeah.
Exactly. So...
How cold was the winter of 44?
You know, I don't remember. We were, I think we were pretty good. We were clothed pretty well. The things that I remember really most vividly was the very early days that we landed in France, when we were still in Normandy, because we really didn't have any quarters, and we had to kind of make do with what we want. There was no such thing as a kitchen for our unit. What we did was we had a big 55-gallon drum. Quote, the cooking service or whoever they were, filled it with water and threw in sea rations. Are you familiar with?
Yeah.
In the can, you know? Sea rations in there, and brought it to a boil, or tried to, you know, with a wooden stove, heat. And we were given, that was our meals for a good many days, you know. In fact, about the only thing that I can remember, or the only thing that I brought back in terms of a physical manifestation of my service, was this scar. You see that scar?
Cut it on a can?
Cut it on a sea ration can. I was
That's
so...
Purple Heart time, isn't it?
What?
That's Purple Heart time.
Yeah. For all the blood that came out of it, it probably would have been. I was so hungry, I remember, and that can was being, you know, it has like the key it's supposed to wrap around, wasn't working, and I grabbed it and I wrapped. Oh, I can remember it to this day. So, and that's the only. So.
Were you there for VE Day?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that like when they announced that the war was over? And
well, there were two events.
That was May, right?
There was the event of President Roosevelt's passing.
Right.
We were there in Europe at that time, and that was a very emotional one for a lot of us. I remember. It was, I recall, it was a very somber and event. And
Well, he led you out of the Depression and led us out of
I mean,
World War II.
for most of us, we didn't know any other president.
Right.
You know,
And he was a fellow Jewish guy.
That's right.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, to me, I didn't know much about Hoover, and Coolidge was the president when I was born, but that didn't mean anything, you know. So yeah, he was the president that I knew, that I know my family voted for, you know, that if I voted, which I didn't, of course, at that time, would have voted for. So, yeah, it was and a lot of people around us, I remember many of my other fellow soldiers were quite taken with his passing. Yeah. And of course, on VE Day, yeah, that was kind of, but I think about that. One of the things, of course, the first question was, what is going to happen to us? You know, everyone wants to know. And they want to know, there was like a point system. And in our unit, you didn't accumulate too many points because we weren't in battle, so you didn't get battle stars. You didn't get Purple Hearts, you know, like my brother got 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star. So, you know, we were all wondering what's going to happen. Well, they didn't keep us wondering too long, because they said, well, you guys are going to be one of the first service troops to go over to Japan. So that's where we headed very, very soon after VE Day. They sent us down to a sort of a marshalling center in Marseille, or in that area, the city of Marseille. And we were there actually about a month.
What was the feeling among the troops about going into Japan?
I don't know if I can think about that or have a reaction to what it was, because the most we knew that the type of unit we were involved in big construction projects. We weren't really combat engineers.
Right.
So the thought, and be surprised, we didn't get too much information. There wasn't a lot that the company captain came out and during the morning whatever we used to call them, marshalling of the troops, tell us what's going on in the world. What they told us was what we're going to do that morning, and that was it. So there wasn't too much information about where we were in the bigger plan. But knowing that we were big construction, generally we figured that we would be involved possibly in port facilities, in making them suitable for larger craft to come to and build dockage and things like that. We weren't Seabees, but we were construction people. So we had a feeling we were going to do that type of work, though it wasn't clear. And as it ended up, what we did do, our major assignment that I remember when we got to Japan was to basically put an airfield, the Itame airfield, in operational order, so very large ships, planes like B-29s could land there, because they weren't designed.
So you were on your way to Japan when the bomb was dropped?
We were on our way to Japan. In fact, we may have even, I think we were just out of Hawaii. We just left Hawaii. We were between Hawaii, and we knew we were going to stop at the Philippines. We weren't going to go directly to Japan, because at that point, Japan was still, an active enemy. We were someplace, I think, soon out of Hawaii. And yeah, I remember that, because we were wondering, are they going to turn us back? That they won't need us? No, it didn't work that way.
And when you left Europe, did you go through the Panama Canal to go to Hawaii?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you didn't go home first?
No.
Oh, okay.
They didn't want to take a chance that...
Yeah, you wouldn't show back up again.
Right.
So you got to Japan and did some work there then, in rebuilding
That's right.
the airport and whatnot.
Yeah.
Interesting. So you're gone for you were gone about a year and a half, I guess, huh? Over in Europe and then going to Japan.
That's true, yeah.
How was going home?
Well, when we got to Japan, actually between going home and getting to Japan, there were a couple of little other adventures that I think I'd like to talk about. One was going to Japan. The trip from the Philippines to Japan, to the mainland, to the Japanese island, through the China Sea. I don't have a map here, but I think it's China Sea. And this was in October of 1945. Mm-hmm. Okay. If you check the history of the weather during that period of time, this is when they have a lot of typhoons, which I think we call cyclones or something like that.
Right.
They're the same type of event. And we were going over, and it was right at that time they were having a really big typhoon. And by the way, we were on the ship, an LST.
That's
Now,
a flat bottom.
flat bottom LST.
Well, that must have been a trip.
So, and LST is not, it's a pretty good sized ship.
Yeah.
You know, it's a few hundred feet long, and it's quite wide, but it's very flat.
Yeah.
You know, it's a cargo carrier, basically, and that's what it was doing. It was carrying our heavy equipment. Normally it would have been carrying tanks and trucks and stuff like that, but for us it was carrying trucks and tanks, not tanks, but bulldozers and heavy road working equipment and things like that, and the troops, of course, that supported that. So we went over in this LST, the North China Sea, during this hurricane. And I think young people probably don't have the perspective to kind of imagine the challenge that they're in, or the danger, if you want to call it, because to us it was kind of a kind of the threatening thing, because we would go up on you know, we could see we weren't allowed on deck because there was no real deck on an LST,
Right.
you know. So, but you could, you know, there's portholes and stuff, but we could see the prow of the boat, and so we'd go up on the wave, and then the boat would reach the crest of the wave, and it would slide down and hit the bottom, and that front of that boat would just shake like this. And you know, this is going on for hours and hours.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're asking, how long can this ship take this stuff?
Before it splits in half, yeah.
And when is it going to go down and it's not going to come up? So anyway, we made the trip. Now, I did a little research on that particular typhoon. There were quite a few U.S. vessels, either supply ships or military ships, that were lost in that particular tropical event. So we were very, very fortunate. And that was kind of one of the high points in terms of, shall we say, adventures.
Yeah.
In my experience, because I didn't have too many other real adventures, you know. In France, I was still just to jump back to France, when we were still in Normandy and the Battle of the Bulge was occurring, there was a potential threat that the Germans, who were still on the Channel Islands, were going to start a second front by attacking the Normandy coast in order to pull our troops back from the Bastogne area. And so that particular threat took us out, since there weren't any regular soldiers, there weren't any infantry or anything, they were all over there, you know, on the eastern side of France, or northeast, or wherever Bastogne is. And so they took people like us to patrol the Normandy coast. So we went out, you know,
With your M1s, huh?
What?
With your M1s.
Yeah, with our M1s, and that's where our one battle star came in.
Wow.
So that's how I got my one battle star, because of that event, you know. So anyway, that was the closest to, shall we say, enemy action that I came, but not the closest, I think, to some serious survival threats like this trip across the China Sea, which at the time I was probably too young and too stupid to realize how serious the situation was.
So did you come home past Hawaii into like San Francisco or Long Beach or what?
No, we went through the canal again.
Again, again, back to New York?
Right.
How was seeing the Statue of Liberty when you first pulled in, having been gone for as long as you've been gone?
You know, I can't remember.
Interesting.
Yeah, I can't really remember the emotions. Japan, well, we kind of skipped over Japan because really Japan was very interesting I was very, very fortunate that I was actually able, as a serviceman, to serve it both in Europe and in Japan in the same military action because I had a chance to kind of compare the two different societies and how they reacted to me as a GI. Okay, and I thought I felt more comfortable in Japan from a security point of view, from an ability to walk around and talk to people, well, to the extent that you could. In general, we were actually cautioned in France when we were there by our superiors to never go out without going in a group, at least a minimum of 3. And I was never received anything like that. And I would take, when I had time off, I would take they had a very excellent high-speed system from Itame to go to Osaka, which was the big city that we were near, on this train. I'm the only Caucasian, the only GI on that train with all these other Japanese people, and I didn't feel in any way ever felt threatened.
Interesting.
It was really interesting.
Well, they were a beaten people. There's no question about that.
What?
They were a beaten people.
They were beaten, but there was, I think, maybe it's because they were so subservient to the commands of their rulers who said, thou shalt not, behave in a disruptive way to these people called our victors or whatever you want to call them, So that's the way that you are. But as I told you, well, there's the picture. There's a couple of pictures. While I was on guard duty, here's that one, yeah. Okay. While I was on guard duty, because I did a lot of guard duty. I got to be a sergeant, but most of the time I was doing guard duty. Either I was pushing prisoners of war, which means I was watching over prisoners of war, or I was doing other types of security type things. Anyway, while I was doing one of my guard duty type jobs in Japan, in Itame, a young man comes up to me, and I could hardly understand him, but I gathered he wanted me to meet either a relative or a friend of his who wanted to learn English. Okay, and so we made arrangements that I would do that. I figured, hey, if maybe I could learn a little Japanese if I can teach this person a little English. So he introduced me to this gentleman here. His name is Kitsu. And he was a former soldier in the Japanese army. He was a sergeant, and I was getting pretty close to being a sergeant at the time. And he had a very nice wife. I don't recall her first name. And they had a little son. And they couldn't have been a nicer, shall we say, representative of what maybe the emperor wanted people to be with regard to the invading, Anglos. But we got along very nicely. They took me around Japan. These were times that I had the chance to be. Here's in one of their parks.
It looks like Nara.
And I think that's in Nara.
Mm-hmm.
And the deers walked around. They're all over the place, and you could feed them. They're kind of, and there were some other pictures, but they're on that jump drive, but I don't see them here. And they wanted me to see some of the cities like Kyoto, We went to Kyoto.
That wasn't damaged at all in World War
No,
II.
no.
Left alone.
I think there was an understanding because of its historical significance that if they could, they would avoid it. And they did. But boy, we really pounded. The area around where we were was just flattened. Because it was basically an industrial area. So it was just a target as much as, and it was right near this little airport. But it was a little airport, but it was still an airport that served the Japanese army. So these people were so nice to me. They introduced me to eating their foods. At the time, I was engaged to a young lady, and our plan was to get married when I got back home, and they knew sooner or later I'd be sending back home. So they gave me gifts to give to her, string of pearls, silk to make her wedding gown, things like that. They're really very nice. In return, I try to help them where I could. One thing they really wanted, if they could get it, were medicines. Then we talk about the basic kinds of things that we go into, into Walgreens to pick up or
Right.
anything. But for them, they were. So one of the things when I got home was that I sent them quite a few care packages of these different medicinal things. I remember one thing they asked for was deworming medication, because a lot of the foods, the way they get it from, they use a lot of night soil for their vegetation. And you got to remember, 1946, it's quite a time ago. Now that I think about it, that they were still, I don't want to say primitive or anything, they weren't, but they were still, had a lot of agrarian practices that nowadays you just wouldn't do, So anyway, things like that were things that I kind of tried to give back, at least for a period of time.
Well, you're a good diplomat.
They were very nice people. No complaints about it. And my experience in Japan was a totally different one. Not so much, if I'm talking about the interaction between me and the populace, was totally different than it was in France, at least in Normandy. I can't recall too much how much interaction I had when we were in Reims. So that was, but the Normans, the people in Normandy were not really very friendly to us. And if you might know, that was one of the stronger components of the Vichy government.
Yeah.
So in general, they weren't too happy about what happened. So anyway, you asked me about coming home.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mentioned that I had been engaged to this young lady before I went away into the service. We were a high school, young high school couple. Met during our time in high school, and it wasn't too much time since that, between that and the time I went into the service. So, but we had kind of an understanding, and Muriel and I always thought that we were going to get married when I got home. Well, about, couldn't have been more than maybe a month or two before we were being told they were keeping us informed about how soon they could start discharging some of us. Because they were discharging us, they were being offering to some of the soldiers were being offered opportunity to stay because of their skills and stuff like that. I didn't have any of that type of capability, so I didn't get any of those offers. So sooner or later, I knew I was going to go home, and so we were thinking about that. Well, about a month or two before I kind of knew I was going to be discharged or sent home for discharge, I get this letter, which what we used to call in the service a Dear John letter. And it came, it was a pretty strong emotional shock, you know, which I couldn't comprehend, you know, the basis for it. And it was a very, very short and direct, and you know, no need to reply type of letter.
Yeah.
So that was not. So my homecoming was actually probably somewhat less than a glorious return. And of course, you know,
But seeing your parents, though, again.
What?
But seeing your parents was a good thing, Mom and
Oh,
Dad.
of course,
And
yes.
your brother came back, too.
Yes, yeah, no question
Yeah.
about that. Well, actually, my brother was still in Europe because he took his discharge. He then went to work as a civilian employee in military government because he spoke German fluently
Wow.
and had very, very good access to being able to communicate the types of things that the military government had to take care of. So he stayed there right after the war. And,
When are you going home?
so anyway, so I came home. So, you know, emotionally, there was not quite the same situation for a conquering hero to come home to because of this relationship being broken. And I have to admit, it probably did interfere somewhat. One of the important things that happened in my time in the service happened when I was on shipboard. And that event was really, and in retrospect, as I go back and think about the relationships that had happened, that event probably triggered the ultimate Dear John letter. And that was this. On my trip over to Japan, there was a copy, and I don't know how old, of Life magazine. And in this Life magazine, there was an article about the University of Chicago. And it said that at this university, you could get a bachelor's degree in 2 years and then go on and get whatever advanced degree if you want to. And of course, here I am, young man, no real college education, but looking forward to something like that. And I said, man, that sounds great. You know, I don't have to wait 4 years to get a bachelor's degree. I can get it in 2 and move on. And not only that, but looking at the university, all the other wonderful things they told me about the University of Chicago, the way its courses were constructed, and this President Chancellor Hutchins and stuff like that, who was involved in the Great Books program and all that stuff, you know, sound like a great idea. And so that kind of came as my objective when I came home. And I probably shared that with Muriel, you know. And maybe it took me close to 60 years to finally realize that that could have been the reason why she wrote the Dear John letter. Because there was no way that Muriel was going to leave New York. She had a mother who was medically dependent on her. She had a younger brother. She was from a divorced family, but her family was still basically there. And the thinking of going, this is what occurred to me 60 years later as to why I would get this Dear John letter. It hit me like an epiphany one morning. I remember it was like 5 o'clock in the morning. And suddenly this came to me. And I said, well, there it is. Why would she want to give or feel that she had to give up to follow me to the University of Chicago?
She let you go, so you
know,
live your dream.
Yeah. So anyway, so that when you asked me about how it felt when I got back, you know, my objective was to go to college, and hopefully, if I could, because the University of Chicago had pretty stringent requirements for admission.
Did you get in? Did you get in?
Chicago?
Yeah, but actually not on the first go-around, so to speak. They didn't. I had to wait until they reanalyzed, and the people who had said they would take enroll, and then decided to drop out, left an opening. I did get in for that for September of 1946. So I did get in when I wanted to get in, but I didn't get in being invited at the first cut, so to speak. And that was, I think, for major events in my life, without having to recapitulate my whole life, I would say my experiences in the Army, followed by my experiences in the University of Chicago, were probably some of the most formative experiences in my life, in terms of what the person who I believe I am.
So you got a college degree then?
I got
Chicago?
both a bachelor's and a master's.
In what?
I got well, you see, the thing that I was going to do, of course, here is in World War II and everything, was I was going to make the world safe for democracy when it was all over. So I thought I would become a teacher, and in social studies, some field like that, where that type of subject would come in, and you can introduce children and young people to all great ideas about democracy. So that was the reason. So I got my degree in a major in social sciences, which meant like poli-sci and economics and anthropology or sociology, kind of like the three areas of, and then a minor in education. So that's where my education was. And I wrote my master's paper on the Japanese democracy in terms of its influence on their educational system.
But that was interesting. Yeah,
What?
that'd be interesting to read.
I don't know.
So did you teach?
What?
Did you teach?
Only for a very short period, for about a year. But one of the things that is the greatest advantage about getting an education at the University of Chicago, it teaches you to think, it teaches you to analyze, it teaches you to be critical, not negatively critical, but evaluative critical. So basically it gave me the foundation really to be an analyst. And I would say if I had to characterize the type of work I did without getting specific about it, it was analytic, a problem solver. And you tell me what the problem is, I'll go out and I'll research the basis for it, what our objectives are, what are the competing interests, what do we have to do to arrive at what we have to do. Here's what my information, my research would lead me to believe,
So you did marry after all.
Oh, yes.
How many children?
I have two daughters.
Two daughters.
Yes, they're identical twins.
Interesting. How many grandkids?
I have 7 grandchildren
How many great-grandchildren?
and just had the 13th great-grandchild only less than 2 weeks ago.
Isn't that exciting stuff? That's just fun to look at that. That keeps you young forever and forever.
Yeah.
Well, I want to close on that question to you, and that is you've seen a lot, you have done a lot, you've got a magnificent life that you've had, you're very successful. Now you've got great-grandchildren. What would you leave for them for a message about what's important in life? What are the priorities you need to think about when you're growing up as a kid?
Well, one thing I would have to say for them, number one, try and keep an open mind. Number two would be to see if you can understand yourself, and that's not always easy. So you can put yourself in perspective. Try to have some goals, but don't feel you gotta do anything in the world to accomplish them.
That's a great perspective.
So
That's good. Well, I want to thank you for coming in today. We really enjoyed our conversation and being able to hear your history, and it's been a fun couple of hours. So I want to thank you again for your service to our country and for being the great guy that you are.
well,
And
thank you very
that'll
much.
conclude our interview for the afternoon.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.